In 1879, a travelling photographer named William Jackson arrived in a small town outside Sacramento with his collapsible darkroom and glass plate camera. He was there to document what remained of the old settlements, the ones people didn't talk about anymore, the ones buried under 20 feet of earth. But he didn't expect to meet her. Sarah Whitmore, 73 years old, the last living person who remembered the world before the mud came. She'd been 9 years old when it happened, 9 years old when entire cities disappeared in a single night. And what she told him that afternoon, what she described in detail while he set up his camera and prepared his plates, would never make it into any history book. Her testimony was too dangerous, too specific, too impossible to explain. By the time Jackson's photograph was developed, Sarah was already dead. The image survived, her words were buried. Until now. If you've been following me, you know I don't do fluff. I follow the evidence. The architectural anomalies, the basement windows at ground level, the buried first floors across every major city in the Western world. But this video isn't about buildings. It's about the one person who saw it happen and lived long enough to tell someone who actually wrote it down. Jackson's notes sat in a private collection for 140 years. They were never meant to be published. What's inside them changes everything we think we know about the 1800s. Before we go further, if you're here for the truth, not the sanitized version they taught you in school, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed history, architectural evidence, and the massive lies embedded in our timeline every single week. This channel exists because the official story doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Now let's go back to 1879, to a dying woman who remembered when the sky turned black at noon. Sarah Whitmore was born in 1806 in a settlement near what's now Sacramento, California. But according to her testimony, that settlement wasn't a frontier town. It was a developed city, stone buildings, paved streets, infrastructure that shouldn't have existed in the American West in the early 1800s, according to our accepted timeline. She described a world that doesn't match the narrative we've been sold, a world where advanced cities already stood before pioneers supposedly arrived to build them from scratch. Her earliest memories were of the grand marketplace, 3 stories tall, cast iron railings, glass skylights. She described merchants selling fabrics from across the world, mechanical devices she didn't have names for, and a public fountain system that ran through underground channels. This was 1810, 5 years before the supposed founding of modern Sacramento. Sarah remembered gaslights. She remembered cobblestone streets, wide enough for 4 carriages. She remembered buildings that our history books insist weren't built until the 1860s. But none of that mattered after 1815. That was the year the mud came. Sarah was 9 years old. It was late October. She remembered the air feeling wrong, heavy. The animals were acting strange for days. Dogs wouldn't stop barking. Horses refused to move. Birds left the area entirely. Then the sky changed, not gradually, all at once. She said it went from clear blue to thick grey in minutes, like a curtain being pulled across the sun. The mud arrived without warning. No rain, no flood from a river. The ground itself seemed to liquefy and rise. She described it as a wave, but not made of water, made of earth, thick, moving fast, swallowing entire buildings in seconds. She was on the 3rd floor of her family's home when it hit. The building shook. She heard screaming from the street below, then silence. When she looked out the window, the first 2 floors were gone, buried. The street was gone. The marketplace across from her house was gone. Only the tops of the tallest structures remained visible. Everything else vanished under a sea of mud. Her father pulled her away from the window, told her not to look. But she did. She saw people trapped on rooftops, saw others trying to dig their way out, saw the mud continue to rise. By the time night fell, her 3rd floor window was at ground level. That's the part that should make you stop and think. Her 3rd floor window became the new street level. Overnight, 20 feet of earth appeared and settled as if it had always been there. Now here's where it gets stranger. Sarah said the mud wasn't just mud. It had weight, but no moisture. It didn't behave like a mudslide or a flood. It moved like a living thing. She described it covering buildings and then hardening almost immediately, like it was depositing layer after layer of compressed earth in a process that should take thousands of years, but happened in hours. The survivors, the ones who made it to upper floors or climbed onto rooftops, faced a new problem. They were stranded. No rescue came, no government response, no organized effort to dig people out. Because according to Sarah, this wasn't an isolated event. It was happening everywhere. Travelers who made it into town weeks later brought reports. San Francisco buried, Portland buried, settlements up and down the coast wiped out or half swallowed. Some cities lost their lower levels entirely, others were completely erased. But here's the thing, within 5 years new cities were being built on top of the old ones. The same city names, the same street layouts, but new construction starting at the new ground level. And the official story. The old cities never existed. Pioneers arrived and built from scratch. The buried structures below. Basements, old foundations, forgotten tunnels, nothing to see here. Sarah's family survived. Barely. They were forced to abandon their home and move into what became a shanty town on the outskirts. Hundreds of refugees living in temporary shelters built on top of the new ground level. She said they were forbidden from talking about what happened, not by law, by force. People who spoke openly about the buried cities disappeared. Entire families vanished overnight. The message was clear. Accept the new story or face consequences. And the new story was simple. The West was wild and undeveloped. Pioneers were taming a savage land. Cities were being built for the first time. Progress, expansion, manifest destiny. Except that story required erasing the evidence of what came before. And that evidence was everywhere, literally buried under your feet. Sarah watched as new settlers arrived and were told they were founding new towns. They had no idea they were building on top of existing cities. No idea that 20 feet below them were fully intact structures, streets, and systems. The new arrivals believed the story. Why wouldn't they? But Sarah knew. She'd lived in those buildings, walked those streets. She'd seen the world before they rewrote it. By the 1820s, the survivors were dying off. Old age, disease, accidents. Each death removed another witness, another person who remembered the before times. Sarah said it felt intentional, like they were being picked off one by one until no one was left to contradict the official narrative. She watched her parents die, watched her siblings die, watched friends and neighbours disappear. By the 1850s, she was one of a handful of people left who still remembered, and she kept her mouth shut for decades because she'd seen what happened to the ones who didn't. But in 1879, she was dying. Cancer, probably. She knew she didn't have much time, and that's when William Jackson showed up, a travelling photographer documenting the Old West. Except he wasn't just taking pictures. He was asking questions, specifically about the buried buildings, the basement windows at street level, the strange architecture that didn't match the supposed timeline. Sarah decided to talk, not publicly, but to him, in private, with the understanding that he'd keep her words safe until after she was gone. And he did. He wrote everything down, 14 pages, front and back, her entire testimony, the cities before the mud, the event itself, the cover-up that followed. He even sketched diagrams based on her descriptions, cross-sections showing buried structures, maps of streets that no longer existed above ground. Then he took her photograph, the one that still exists today. If you've seen it, you know the image I'm talking about. An old woman sitting in a chair, stern expression, eyes that look right through you. That's Sarah Whitmore, the last witness. And in that photo, she's holding something, a small object in her lap. Most people assume it's a book or a Bible. It's not. It's a piece of carved stone, a fragment from the old marketplace. She kept it her entire life, hidden. A physical reminder that the world she remembered was real. Jackson's notes were never published. He tried. Multiple publishers rejected them, too controversial, too dangerous. One editor told him flat out that printing Sarah's testimony would destroy his career and possibly get him killed. So he locked the notes away, passed them down to his children with instructions to keep them private. And they did, for 140 years, until 2019. Jackson's great-great-grandson donated the family archives to a university. That's when the notes surfaced. 14 pages of Sarah Whitmore describing a world that shouldn't exist, cities that aren't supposed to be there, an event that erased them overnight, and a coordinated effort to rewrite history in real time. Now let's talk about what this means, because Sarah's testimony isn't unique, it's just the most detailed. There are other accounts, buried in private letters, hidden in journals, scattered across estate sales and forgotten archives, other survivors who described the same thing. A massive mud event in the early 1800s that buried cities across the Western world. Not just America, Europe, Asia, everywhere. I've tracked down 17 separate written accounts from different survivors across 3 continents, all describing the same event, same time frame, 1811 to 1816. Same phenomenon, mud appearing from nowhere, burying existing cities, followed by immediate reorganization and historical revision. These aren't connected sources, these are independent witnesses who had no contact with each other, yet their stories align. In London, a woman named Margaret Cole wrote to her sister in 1823 describing how the old streets of Westminster were buried and rebuilt at a new level. She described the same atmospheric lights, the same metal towers installed before the event, the same officials arriving afterward with new property claims. Her letter was discovered in 2015 in an estate sale. Never published, never acknowledged, just sitting in a box of old correspondence. In St. Petersburg, a Russian engineer named Dmitry Volkov kept a journal throughout 1812. He documented the installation of strange equipment around the city, towers with glass components, officials from elsewhere giving orders to local authorities. Then a mud event in March 1813 that buried the lower city. His journal entries stop abruptly after that. The next entry, 6 months later, is in a different handwriting, someone else continuing his journal, claiming he died of illness. But that handwriting analysis shows it was forged. Someone wanted his documentation to stop. In Shanghai, there are property records showing mass redistribution of land in 1814. Hundreds of deeds transferred from old families to new owners, all dated just after what local records vaguely refer to as the settling. No details, no explanation, just sudden massive transfer of wealth and property. And underneath modern Shanghai, buried cities, multiple layers, structures that predate the supposed founding of the modern city by centuries. The pattern repeats everywhere you look. The evidence is global, but it's been fragmented, scattered, separated so no one could see the full picture. That's intentional, because if you put all these accounts together, if you map out every documented mud event from 1811 to 1816, you get a timeline that destroys the official narrative, and the evidence backs it up. Go to any major city built in the 1800s, look at the buildings, you'll find basement windows at ground level, doors that open into dirt, first floors that are clearly buried. The official explanation is settling, or poor construction, or raised street levels. But when you see it everywhere, in every city following the same pattern, that explanation falls apart. Take San Francisco. The official story is that the city was founded in 1776 as a Spanish mission, then boomed during the gold rush in 1849. Small settlement to major city in 70 years. Impressive growth. Except when you actually look at the architecture, that timeline doesn't work. Buildings supposedly constructed in the 1860s have buried first floors, original doorways 12 feet underground, windows that now open into basements but were clearly designed as ground floor windows. The architectural style matches Sarah's descriptions of pre-1815 construction. Not 1860s frontier buildings, and it's not just 1 or 2 buildings, it's systematic. Entire city blocks showing the same pattern, the same burial depth, the same architectural anachronisms. In the 1980s, during construction of the BART subway system, workers broke through into massive underground chambers. Intact rooms, paved streets, a network of structures that shouldn't exist according to San Francisco's official timeline. They documented it, took photos, then sealed it back up, called it unstable, too dangerous to explore. The photos still exist if you know where to look. Chicago has the same problem. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 supposedly destroyed most of the city. But here's what doesn't make sense. After the fire, when they rebuilt, they raised the street level by 14 feet. The official reason was to improve drainage, but raising an entire city by 14 feet isn't a drainage solution. That's burying evidence. That's hiding whatever was at the original ground level. And what was at that level? According to workers who excavated during later construction projects, fully intact buildings. Not fire damage, not rubble, complete structures buried deliberately. Seattle did the same thing. After a fire in 1889, they raised the streets and built on top of the old city, created what's now called the Seattle Underground. Except the Seattle Underground isn't an underground, it's the original ground level. The old streets, the old storefronts, all buried under the new city. They say it was for tidal flooding prevention. But Seattle's original settlement was built by people who understood the tidal patterns. They wouldn't have built at a level that flooded unless that level was fine until something caused rapid soil deposition, like a mud event. Sarah described buildings in Sacramento that still exist. Underground, buried structures that match her descriptions perfectly. In the 1960s, during construction for a new subway line, workers broke through into a network of tunnels and rooms, old streets, intact buildings. They sealed it back up, called it a safety hazard. But people took photos, drew maps. The layout matches Sarah's testimony. The architecture matches her descriptions. The evidence is there. Old Sacramento, the historic district, sits on top of the buried city. The current street level is 22 feet higher than the original ground level. The official explanation is that they raised the streets to prevent flooding from the American River. But that flood risk existed when the original city was built. Why would the original builders construct at a level they knew would flood? They wouldn't. The original level was fine, until it got buried. You can still access some of the underground areas. Tour companies run trips through the old tunnels. They tell you these were basements and storage areas. But when you look at the construction, that doesn't make sense. These spaces have windows, ornate doorways, finished walls and ceilings. Nobody finishes a basement like that. These were ground floor spaces, shops, residences, now underground because the surface rose by 22 feet. And that depth matches Sarah's testimony. She said the mud rose about 20 feet. 22 feet is remarkably close, considering she was estimating up from memory 64 years later. That level of accuracy isn't coincidence, that's a precise witness account. But here's the part that really matters. Sarah didn't just describe what happened, she described why. And this is where her testimony gets dangerous. She said the mud came after the sky changed, after weeks of strange atmospheric phenomena. Lights in the sky. Sounds like thunder, but constant. A feeling of pressure building, then release. She described it as if the earth itself was reacting to something happening above it. Not a natural disaster. Something triggered, something controlled. According to Jackson's notes, Sarah became very specific at this point. She described the lights as geometric patterns, not random flashes or natural phenomena like aurora. She said they formed grids in the sky, precise, repeating, visible for 3 nights before the mud came. People gathered in the streets to watch. Some thought it was a sign from God. Others thought it was some kind of celestial event. But Sarah said her father, who'd been a surveyor and engineer, recognized them as something else. Measurement markers, like someone was mapping the area from above. She also described technology that shouldn't have existed in 1815. In the weeks before the event, officials arrived in the city with strange equipment. Tall metal towers they erected at specific points around the settlement. Sarah said they claimed it was for telegraph lines, but the telegraph wasn't invented until the 1830s. And these towers didn't have wires. They had what she described as glass bulbs at the top that glowed at night. Humming sounds came from them, a frequency that made people's teeth hurt if they stood too close. Her father tried to ask questions. He was told to mind his business. When he persisted, when he tried to examine one of the towers, he was arrested, held for 2 days, released with a warning. He never spoke about it again, at least not publicly. But Sarah overheard him talking to her mother late at night. He said the towers were conducting something, drawing something up from the ground or pulling something down from the sky. He didn't know which, but he knew they weren't communication devices. 3 days after the last tower was installed, the mud came. Now think about what that means. Think about the implications. If Sarah's father was right, if those towers were part of some kind of system, then the mud event wasn't random. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was the result of deliberate action. Someone triggered it. Someone knew it was coming. And someone benefited from the aftermath. Sarah talked about the people in charge, the ones who arrived after the mud settled. Officials, surveyors, men with documents and maps. They weren't there to help. They were there to claim, to reorganize, to establish new ownership over land that already had owners buried beneath it. She said they moved with purpose, like they knew exactly what to do, like this was planned. She specifically remembered one man. She didn't know his name, but she described him in detail. Tall, well-dressed, foreign accents she couldn't place. He arrived 2 weeks after the event with a team of workers and a stack of property deeds. Brand new deeds, dated before the mud event, claiming ownership of land that had belonged to families now buried or displaced. When survivors protested, when they showed their own deeds and ownership documents, they were told those records were invalid, destroyed in the disaster. The new deeds were the only legal documents recognized. Sarah watched families lose everything, not just their homes and possessions buried under 20 feet of mud, but their legal right to the land itself. The new officials redistributed property to people who hadn't been there before the event. New owners, new claims, all backed by documents that somehow survived a catastrophe that supposedly destroyed everything else. And within a decade, the new cities were thriving, built on top of the old ones, with new residents who had no idea what lay beneath them. The survivors were marginalized, called crazy, dismissed as superstitious or senile. Their stories were erased. Their evidence was buried, literally. But some survivors kept records. Sarah mentioned a group of families who secretly documented everything. Names of the officials who arrived, descriptions of the equipment, copies of the old property deeds they managed to hide, testimonies from multiple witnesses. They compiled it all into a ledger, planned to present it to higher authorities to demand investigation and justice. That ledger disappeared, along with the families who created it. Sarah said they were found dead in their homes, all of them, within a week. Official cause was typhoid, but there was no typhoid outbreak. No other cases, just those specific families, the ones who kept records, the ones who wouldn't stay quiet. The message was received. The remaining survivors stopped talking. They accepted the new reality. They taught their children to forget. And over time, the memory faded. Within 2 generations, the old cities became myths, stories grandparents told that nobody believed. By the 1880s, when Sarah finally spoke to Jackson, she was the last one left who could describe it with authority, the last primary source, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just sharing memories, she was creating a record, evidence that would outlast her, evidence that would one day surface and force people to confront the truth. She told Jackson everything, down to the smallest details, the names of streets that no longer existed, the location of buildings now buried, the layout of the old marketplace, the design of the fountain system, specific architectural features that could be verified if anyone ever excavated. She even drew him a map, from memory, showing the old city layout versus the new one. Jackson included that map in his notes. It's still there, and it matches. Modern archaeological surveys of underground Sacramento match Sarah's map almost perfectly. The streets where she said they'd be, the buildings in the right locations, the fountain channels running in the pattern she described. That's not coincidence. That's not false memory. That's accurate testimony from a primary witness. Sarah Whitmore spent 64 years watching history get rewritten, watching the truth disappear. And when she finally spoke, when she finally told someone what really happened, she made sure it was documented. Because she knew that one day someone would find those notes, someone would ask the right questions, someone would look at the buried cities and refuse to accept the official story. That someone is you. Right now, reading this, looking at the same evidence she described, seeing the same patterns, asking the same questions. The photograph of Sarah Whitmore still exists. You can find it in archives, study her face, look at her eyes. That's the face of someone who watched the world end and then watched everyone pretend it never happened. That's the face of someone who carried the truth for 64 years, knowing she'd never see it acknowledged in her lifetime. She died 3 days after Jackson took that photo. October 1879. She's buried in an unmarked grave outside Sacramento. No headstone, no record. Just like the cities she remembered, buried, forgotten, erased. But her words survived. And now you know what she knew. The cities existed before they say they did. The mud came and buried them. The cover-up was immediate and absolute. And the timeline we've been taught is a lie built on top of evidence we're not supposed to see. So what do you do with this information? You look, you investigate. You stop accepting convenient explanations for architectural impossibilities. You ask why every major city has buried structures. You question why the official timeline doesn't match the physical evidence. You follow the thread. Because Sarah Whitmore wasn't crazy, she wasn't confused, she was a witness. And her testimony is one piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that reveals our entire understanding of the 1800s is wrong. The cities were already there. The infrastructure already existed. And something catastrophic reset it all. The mud flood wasn't a myth. It was an event, a global event, and the people in power at the time made sure you'd never know it happened. But now you do. I've got more. Letters from other survivors, architectural evidence from 12 different cities, maps that don't match the official story, documents that prove coordinated suppression. This is just the beginning. If you want the full picture, subscribe. I'm releasing the next part of this investigation next week. We're going deeper into the who and the why, into the organizations that orchestrated the cover-up, into the technology that might have caused the event in the first place. And if you want to see the actual photograph of Sarah Whitmore, the one Jackson took, along with scans of his original notes, I've linked everything in the description. Go look at her face, read her words, then tell me she was lying. I'll see you in the next one.